The night was supposed to be like any other, just another quiet evening as Marcus walked home from work, his mind occupied with thoughts of his family and bills that needed paying. But that all changed the moment flashing red and blue lights lit up the street behind him. A police cruiser rolled to a stop, and before Marcus could even process what was happening, an officer stepped out, his hand already resting on his holster. "License and ID," the cop demanded, his tone sharp, his eyes filled with something Marcus had seen too many times before: prejudice. Marcus complied, staying calm, knowing how these situations could go. But as he reached into his wallet, the officer's gaze locked onto something else: the cash Marcus had just withdrawn for rent. That's when everything shifted. The officer's expression darkened, and in a low voice, he muttered, "Where'd you get this kind of money?" Before Marcus could answer, the cop snatched the bills from his hands. Marcus's heart pounded. He wanted to protest, but he knew better than to escalate. The street was empty. Who would believe him? Then in a twist neither of them saw coming, another car screeched to a stop. A tall, sharp-dressed man stepped out. "Is there a problem here, officer?" His badge glinted under the streetlights. FBI. Everything was about to change. The officer stiffened at the sight of the badge, his grip tightening around the cash. His expression flickered between surprise and irritation as he took a step back. Marcus turned toward the new arrival, his chest still heaving from the tension. The man's face was familiar, though it took a moment for recognition to set in. It was Elijah, his old friend from the neighborhood. But this wasn't the same kid Marcus used to play ball with. Elijah was an FBI agent now, and from the sharpness in his eyes, he wasn't here to play games. "Funny, I was just about to ask the same thing," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. His eyes moved between Marcus and the officer, reading the situation instantly. "Why are you holding his money?" The officer cleared his throat, his fingers still curled around the bills. "Standard procedure. Just making sure everything checks out." Elijah took a slow step forward, his presence alone shifting the energy. "And what exactly are you checking?" "Because last I checked, carrying cash wasn't a crime." Marcus could see the officer's jaw tighten. He wasn't expecting this. Maybe he assumed no one would question him. Maybe he thought Marcus was just another man who'd stay quiet. But this time, things were different, and the officer knew it. The officer exhaled sharply, his grip loosening just enough for the bills to crinkle in his hand. He glanced at Elijah, then back at Marcus, weighing his next move. His authority had never been questioned like this before, especially not in a situation where he expected no resistance. "This isn't necessary," the officer muttered, shoving the cash back at Marcus. "Just doing my job." Marcus took his money slowly, his hand steady, even though his pulse was racing. He had been here before, cornered, accused, dismissed. But this time, someone was standing beside him. Someone who had the power to turn the tables. Elijah didn't budge. His sharp gaze never left the officer, reading him like a book. "Your job?" he repeated, his voice measured. "Because what I see is a man who pulled over someone without cause and took his money without reason." The officer's jaw clenched. "Are you accusing me of something?" Elijah let the silence stretch for just a moment, then took another step forward, lowering his voice. "Not yet." The officer shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable. His confidence, which had been rock solid moments ago, was cracking under Elijah's stare. Marcus felt it too, the shift in power, the unspoken warning. The officer wasn't untouchable anymore, and he knew it. But just as it seemed like things might de-escalate, the radio on the officer's shoulder crackled. A voice came through, clipped and urgent. "Unit 7, what's your status?" The officer hesitated before pressing the button. "All good," he said, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. Elijah smirked slightly, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You sure about that?" Something about the way he said it made Marcus tense up. The situation wasn't over. Not yet. There was more beneath the surface, something unsaid, something bigger. And for the first time, Marcus wondered if this was really about him at all, or if he had just stumbled into something far more dangerous. The officer shifted his stance, his fingers twitching slightly near his belt. He wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. His attention was locked on Elijah, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Marcus could feel it, the unspoken challenge between them. The officer had gotten away with things like this before, but this time there was a witness. And not just any witness, someone with real authority. Someone who couldn't be ignored. Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying the officer's every move. "You seem nervous," he said, his voice even, but there was an edge to it. "Something wrong?" The officer forced a chuckle, but it was hollow. "Nothing's wrong. Just didn't expect to be interrogated for doing my job." Elijah took another step forward, his presence filling the space. "See, that's the problem. This doesn't look like your job. It looks like something else." His eyes flicked down to the officer's name tag. "Officer Reynolds, right." Reynolds swallowed, his jaw tightening. The name being spoken aloud changed the air between them. Marcus saw it, the way the officer's eyes flickered with something unreadable, the way his shoulders stiffened as if bracing for a storm. Then Elijah pulled out his phone, holding it up just enough for Reynolds to see the screen. "You've been on my radar for a while," Elijah said smoothly. "There's a pattern here. Unjustified stops. Money going missing. Complaints that never seem to stick." He took a slow breath. "Tell me, how long did you think that would last?" Marcus's eyes widened slightly. This was bigger than just him. This wasn't a random stop. This wasn't just about one cop pushing his luck. Reynolds let out a slow breath, but his hands curled into fists. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're out of your jurisdiction." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" He turned the phone toward Marcus. On the screen was a list of names, case files, incident reports. Some of them Marcus recognized. People from his neighborhood. People who had stories just like his. A chill ran through him. How deep did this go? How many others had been through what he just experienced? Reynolds' radio crackled again. This time, the voice was different. Sharper, more commanding. "Unit 7, we need you back at the station. Now." Marcus saw it, the hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty in the officer's face. But beneath it, something else. Fear. Elijah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Looks like your time just ran out." Reynolds stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then slowly he stepped back toward his car. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Reynolds lingered for a moment, his fingers flexing at his sides, as if deciding whether to walk away or push back. Then, without another word, he turned and moved toward his cruiser. Marcus exhaled, but something about the way Reynolds walked, stiff, controlled, sent a warning through his gut. This wasn't defeat. This was something else. Elijah seemed to sense it too. His eyes stayed on Reynolds, watching every movement, every twitch of his jaw. But just as the officer reached his door, his radio crackled again. This time, the voice was low, almost hushed. "Unit 7, you are not to return. Stand by for further instructions." Reynolds froze. So did Elijah. Marcus glanced between them, his stomach twisting. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah didn't answer. He was watching Reynolds, whose face had gone rigid. His hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon, but on something else. His keys. Then, without warning, Reynolds spun on his heel, yanked open his door, and jumped in. The engine roared to life, tires screeching against the pavement as the cruiser shot forward. Elijah's jaw tightened. He's running. Marcus felt a jolt of panic. Running from what? Elijah didn't hesitate. He was already moving toward his own car, his voice sharp. From whoever just told him not to come back. Marcus barely had time to process before Elijah was behind the wheel, his headlights cutting through the night. Reynolds was already speeding down the street, but Elijah didn't wait. He gunned the engine and took off after him. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a bad cop getting caught. This was bigger. Someone didn't want Reynolds coming back. Someone was pulling strings from the shadows. And for the first time, Marcus realized he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than he ever imagined. Marcus stood in stunned silence, the distant wail of sirens barely registering in his ears. His mind raced. Who was giving orders over the radio? Why was Reynolds running? His gut told him this was bigger than one corrupt cop, something deeper, more dangerous. Elijah's car tore down the road, headlights cutting through the darkness as he closed in on Reynolds. The officer swerved recklessly, tires screeching as he took sharp turns, desperate to shake the pursuit. But Elijah was relentless, his grip tight on the wheel, his expression unreadable. Then suddenly, Reynolds veered off the main road, speeding toward an abandoned construction site on the outskirts of town. Elijah followed without hesitation, his tires kicking up dust as he skidded to a stop. He jumped out, hand near his holster, scanning the area. Reynolds' cruiser sat idle near a half-built structure, the driver's side door swinging open. But he was nowhere in sight. Marcus arrived moments later, his breath heavy as he ran up beside Elijah. Where is he? Elijah didn't answer. He was already moving, his instincts sharp, his eyes sweeping the shadows. Then a rustle, a figure darting toward the back of the building. Elijah was on him in seconds, tackling Reynolds to the ground before he could escape. Talk, Elijah demanded, pinning him down. Who was that on the radio? Reynolds gritted his teeth, breathing hard. You don't get it, he muttered. You think I'm the problem? He let out a bitter laugh. I was just following orders. Elijah's jaw tightened. Whose orders? Reynolds hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. A single gunshot rang out, slicing through the night. Marcus flinched as Reynolds' body jerked, a red stain blooming across his chest. He gasped, his eyes wide in shock. Elijah spun around, his weapon drawn, but the shooter was already gone. The only sound was the wind howling through the unfinished building. Reynolds coughed, his body trembling as he tried to speak. Elijah leaned in close, urgency in his voice. Who did this? Reynolds' lips parted, but his breath came in short, shallow gasps. He struggled for words, then, barely above a whisper, he rasped, You have no idea how deep this goes. His head lolled to the side, and his body went still. Marcus' stomach dropped. This wasn't just corruption. This was something far more dangerous, something powerful enough to silence its own people. Elijah clenched his jaw, his mind already racing. Reynolds was just a piece of a much larger puzzle. And now they weren't just witnesses. They were targets. Elijah exhaled slowly, his eyes still locked on Reynolds' lifeless body. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of sirens growing louder. Marcus took a shaky step back, his mind racing. This wasn't how he thought the night would end. Elijah finally stood, sliding his gun back into its holster. His expression was unreadable, but Marcus could tell this wasn't over for him. It wasn't just about Reynolds. It was about whoever was pulling the strings. Marcus swallowed hard. What now? Elijah glanced at him, his jaw tightening. Now, he looked back toward the empty darkness where the shooter had disappeared. Now we stay smart. The sirens closed in, and within moments, flashing lights bathed the site in red and blue. Officers poured in, securing the scene. Elijah kept his badge visible, giving quick, controlled statements, but he didn't say everything. Not yet. Marcus watched as Reynolds' body was loaded into an ambulance, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had almost lost everything. But somehow he had gained something too, a truth he hadn't seen before. As he turned to Elijah, he realized one thing was certain. This wasn't the end.